Hi, okay, so I guess a bit of context. My name is Andy. I guess what's the relevant part here is I did neuroscience at university, a subject I still find very interesting. I now work in the kind of private finance world, but Sam and I have been very good friends since university, and we lived together and studied together. And for the last sort of 7, 8 years, we've just been having a lot of conversations about everything. I think why are we doing this? I mean, at least from my perspective, I feel like I want to do more things I enjoy. And one of the things I really enjoy is having conversations with Sam, having conversations with other people with Sam. I figure why not just record it? I don't really care if anything goes anywhere, to be honest. I'm just here to have a good time and talk about things I enjoy. I mean that's me. I'm sure Sam will give a little intro here as well.
Yeah, very much echo a lot of things that you just said there. I also, um, yeah, very much enjoy our conversations and our conversations with other people. I think that when we talk, it provokes more thoughts and motivates me to explore things further. And I think ultimately that's what one of the things that I enjoy most about my life is the freedom I have to like explore ideas, have chats with you and other people. But yeah, I also, as Andy said, studied with Andy. I did maths, and I think that's how that's helped me is actually look at things uh from from certain axioms and from those axioms how do we create a certain framework for approaching life's deepest problems and I guess solutions as well to those problems. And that's something that's always interested me, I think. One of the interesting things I think for me and Andy, actually, maybe this could be a good segue into how we started, was that we've I think we both have a past of where we're both very critical of anything that was metaphysical or supernatural, and we would have a very materialistic view of the world. And I remember so clearly being a student and going to Christian talks with the sole purpose of just debating the Christians at the end of the talk, and I'd be like, oh my God, like how do you believe that there's a God, that there's a man in the sky that is answering your prayers, um, and I would try and trap them, and say like, well, what about if you pray that the football team that you support is going to win tomorrow, and then another person prays that their team is going to win tomorrow, and then how can God basically answer both these two prayers? And if your prayer is answered, then why was your prayer answered? And how and if your prayer wasn't answered, then how do you know your prayer uh was like how do you only say that your prayer is answered when it happens? And if it doesn't happen, then you basically come up with some explanation of why it didn't happen. So either way, like there's always this sort of like underlying belief that whatever your God does is right and things. And I just was always, yeah, just so confused about how someone could live their life thinking that there's someone that just lives above them. But I think very interestingly, over time, Andy and I have thought a lot about uh, recent author, specifically Tom Holland, and other critical thinkers like Jordan Peterson and I guess Sam Harris in a way. But basically, these two schools of thought, and we've tried to like figure out how we can how these two ideas can actually complement each other. And I think that one of the interesting things for me, and I'd love to hear your take on it, is that actually this is something I thought about today following the Richard Dawkins and Jordan Peterson conversation, was how actually Jordan Peterson couldn't have created the explanation or the sort of worldview that he tells, and Tom Holland either couldn't have shared this whole explanation if the groundwork wasn't already laid for him to do it, and that groundwork being the materialism that Richard Dawkins and his lot have sort of embedded into our culture. So and obviously like his predecessors, like the Enlightenment people from the 18th century, and I think this world point of materialism has actually given us some like tangible and I guess tools to play with to actually see Christian from a different perspective and perhaps from in a very useful perspective because otherwise I I don't see how Christianity could have actually uh, become so relevant if we didn't have these sort of tangible tools to actually look at Christianity with. But yeah, I know I kind of rambled on there, but that's I'm just trying to sort of like create a sort of like segue into like what we want to talk about.
I think for me, where I approach this is naturally quite a neuroscientific angle. And the thing that's changed the most about my worldview this last year, I would say, is um, I now think there's kind of like, in a way, two different worlds to play in. And in a sense, they both really work because they both exist at the same time, but neither one kind of has primacy over the other in a sense. So you have this like physical world out there, which when you like swing the pendulum, you will get the pendulum swing degrading X times. It's this physical world that has like physical properties that you can conjecture about, provide explanations about that improve over time. And that's very much like Deutschian, like Karl Popper, just like pure scientific method science. But then there's this other world, which is the layer of human perception. And I would say that the kind of, to tie this into the neuroscience angle, um, the, the 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 strain of thought in neuroscience I'm most excited about at the moment is like this perceptual processing machine, which basically says that like the entire reality we perceive is pretty much entirely constructed in your head based on very limited sensory data, mostly as like a constant prediction for what the next thing that's going to happen is going to be. And it's trying to minimize prediction error constantly. So actually, like when I'm going to look at my room, most of my perception of what's happening in my room is already the model that my brain has built of what the room looks like. And it doesn't need very much new data to to keep that model constrained. So actually, it's a lot of it's in your head. And I think these two different layers represent the two different layers that Dawkins and Peterson are talking about. And I'm happy to dig into that way more deeply because that's just a very light brush on that idea that I'm going to start developing as well a little bit more. But I guess in summary, like, the X photon of light doesn't mean you perceive X color. It doesn't mean you perceive, X thing. There's so many layers of perception built into all of, the world you construct for yourself. That something that can be true, something that can be true in the physical world, like it can just be true that there is a steel atom in this point in space, but then something can be true about your perception of that, and they can be two different things. And this is where I think the rubber hits the road for me with the kind of various religious traditions and like, there is so much leeway for you to proactively construct a reality around yourself. And I think where Sam and I talk a lot is the better or worse ways in order that you can construct that reality. And that's where I think the disagreement between Peterson and Dawkins comes in actually, because they're actually just talking about two different realities. And it's like literally like it's literally like a brain on screen. Like Dawkins is on the left as an actual left brain, and Peterson's on the right. There's all these like comments, whereas like Peterson is like, well, let's hit two birds with one stone, and Dawkins like, that's scientifically impossible. You can't hit two birds with one. You know what I mean? Like, whereas like on the one hand, Dawkins is so literally true and so imbibed in like the physical reality of any given situation. Like, how does X atom collide with X produce Y result, or like how do these genes interact to cause that? And Peterson is so, I guess, what Dawkins would call drunk on symbolism, but they're actually just talking about two different ways that things can be true, in my opinion. Like something that can be true about your brain, like the fact that placebo works, even though there's actually no biochemical physical change for a sugar pill doing something, but your belief that something ought to be painful can be super powerful in how you perceive that. Like, for example, there's a very famous case of a scaffolder in the UK who jumped off some scaffolding and he saw this nail come through his boot, and he's lying on the floor writhing in pain. There's this like long rusty nail like poking out of his shoe. The ambulance arrives, they administer like analgesics, like powerful painkillers, and then they take off his boot, and it had gone between his toes. But his expectation was such, like, so deep in the fact that, my whole model of reality at this point thinks that this has gone through my foot, therefore I expect the pain to be coming from there, is my point basically. It's like it wasn't the actual reality of the situation, but that was true at the psychological layer of this guy's brain. Therefore, that caused his reality to literally shift, even though there was no, again, change to the underlying. There was no set of steel atoms that had pushed through the nervous tissue in his foot that had caused, the neurons to fire a pain signal to his brain. Like, it was actually the other way around. It was like his perception of the situation had back propagated the fact that he should be in pain down to his foot, and that's where his model had come. And so, I just like I've also done a little ramble here, but I think this is where I think you cannot get daylight between Dawkins and Peterson, because you've literally got a left brain and a right brain talking to each other. And I love that comment from Alex O'Connor, where he's like, "I'm actually a corpus callosum in this conversation," because he is literally the one trying to connect these two completely different universes together. And I think the people who are going to do really well in the 21st century, and this is something I've been thinking about a lot, are the people who really understand this concept of like how something could be true at the psychological layer, and not like lose the fact that just because it's not literally true or a literal fact about reality doesn't mean it's not true about how people frame or interpret a situation. And I think that for me is a nice segue into the rest of this conversation as well.
Yeah, there's basically time in our culture, I think, where we need to distinguish between exactly the two types of truths that you've alluded to, and how I mean, we don't need to invent new words, but basically we I think what Richard Dawkins would believe is that things that are factual are true, and that things and vice versa, and that things that are true are factual. There's, I think, uh, where Jordan Peterson would look at it is that things that are factual need not be true, and things that are true need not be factual. That there are two separate categories, and the I mean, a lot of what you're talking about reminds me of the whole debate between uh, Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson when they're talking about metaphorical truths, and I think that I mean that idea has been very well sort of talked about, and so we don't need to go too much into like what into the idea of metaphorical truths. The thing that interests me though is that basically when we have this idea of truth, truth then becomes something more than factual. It becomes, I mean, I guess it's probably important for us to define what these two categories are then. What is something that is factual, and then what is something that is true? And so how I look at it is that something that is factual is something that is empirically observed, or can be empirically observed. And something that is true is something that I am definitely stealing these definitions from Jordan Peterson, but he would say that truth is something that serves life, or that something that well, and I know that he's actually taken that from Nietzsche as well. So, but something is like a truth is something that progresses life. So, for example, is it true that is it true that a gun is always loaded? Well, then that's the example that they gave in that talk, and obviously that would serve life in a very obvious way, because if everyone believed that the gun was always loaded when they were given it, then the a misfiring would basically would
Be
occur
less likely.
less often. And so I think that's how I look at it. then therefore when we're talking about then the interesting point here, which is I'm not sure how I can't remember if Richard Dawkins and Jordan Peterson were able to actually come to an agreement here, but the next question is how do you get truths from the facts? So if Richard Dawkins is a scientist and he is a scientist, and then he delves in facts, Dawkins seems to care so much about facts, and he says like all I care about is what is factually true, or yeah, what is a fact. But the and something that I was listening to earlier today was that he has to have a he has to have a prior belief that it's important, that facts are important. Why does Richard Dawkins believe that facts are so important? And that has to be predicated on the idea of that the truth will set you free, or that the truth will actually serve life. And so like he has to implicitly believe in the idea of seeking
Yeah.
truth in order to actually be a good scientist. And that's the thing that I think that he's not understood. And you can't, and even if Richard Dawkins was to to sort of deny that, then when he's a scientist in the lab, he has to basically prioritize, well, what facts is he going to discover basically? And even doing that, he has to have some implicit uh perspective on what's valuable and what's not valuable. So he has to have a framework of like what he should prioritize when he's in the lab. And he's basically acting under some meta ethic that you have to be truthful when you're being a scientist, because he could obviously, fill numbers and things like that, but he's not doing that. He's acting as a very honest agent, and so he implicitly carries some idea of truth when he's even being a scientist. And I think that's one of the interesting things about him, is that he just doesn't seem to click for him.
My interesting question, like I always ask like super empirical people, is and I think it's a real differentiator because this really like attacks the heart of um the difference between these two types of truth in a really like kind of practical way. And that is let's take Neuropen that was targeted for back pain or period pain relief. And it was marketed saying, Nurofen, it's a form of ibuprofen, and this is specifically good for back pain.
Yeah,
And it's twice the price of regular Nurofen, but this is the one that's going to sort you out. And it got banned in the UK because ostensibly it was just regular old ibuprofen. However, study after study showed that it was way better at relieving back pain because of people's expectation that it was going to relieve the back pain. So in a sense, it's not a full placebo because it is actually an analgesic in there, but like it's some kind of psychological operation going on there. And they banned it in the UK. They said, well, look, from a scientific perspective, from an empirical perspective, this is just the exact same compound, ignoring the fact that both the marketing of that drug and the price of that drug, the fact that it was more expensive, were both two things that were alleviating pain because you're like, well, this is more expensive. Um, and so my question to these types of people is like, well, what do we do with that, right? Like, what do you, why, like, should that be illegal? Like, should it be illegal to say this is better for pain relief in a specific way when it actually is, but not for any like practical reason, but because for a purely psychological reason? And I think that is the kind of question Richard Dawkins would be like, well, of course it should be illegal because there is no, um, there's no biochemical reason why that would change things. But then Jordan Peterson would be like, well, of course it should be legal. Like, the effects, look at the effects and look at the whole psychological stack that's like kind of back propagating down to the perception of the back pain or the period pain or whatever. Um, so that for me is, I think, like I always ask that question to people who are very much kind of on the empirical side of things. Um, and ultimately, though, I think, the same problem you have there, and I think it's the same problem Peterson has, to be honest, is where does that stop? Like, because it's less like testable, it's less like obviously empirical. Like where does it, where does it get too much in a way? Um, and so yeah, I think yeah, I mean, curious, what are your thoughts there on that? Like, would you make that illegal?
Well, yeah, I think that's the right question. Is like when does it get too much? For example, like like crystals. Like some people find that crystals are healing, and
Right.
it probably does have some positive effect, you know, if you're bought into that. And but should it be illegal for a doctor to prescribe you crystals?
Yeah, or people to sell you crystals to cure your cancer, which they probably should be having radiotherapy, you know. Um, so yeah, I think there has to be I mean, this is like kind of again ties back to empirical, but there has to be a deeper model of medicine, I think, which factors in the perceptual brain, which factor, and this is completely off the topic, I guess now to an extent, but you cannot have the deepest possible theory of medicine if your theory of medicine does not include the fact that the brain um, can again like backpropagate its own predictions about any given situation down onto the body. So, for example, like we know for a fact, like stress and like your psychological state massively impacts your immune system. Um, we know chronic pain. A lot of it is eventually nothing. There's no like negative stimulus. It's just like the expectation that you would be in pain. And we know, for example, that even like mental illness, a huge amount of this is just how you're framing your situation. I'm not going to say we can cure anxiety and depression, but a lot of it is like your predictive model is saying, and this is going to tie to what we actually started wanting to talk about, but in my situation is like I am depressed, therefore I predict nothing good to happen to me. Therefore, I predict that I will wake up and nothing's going to change about my situation, and it's going to continue in this kind of this doom spiral. And then, you know, you then go out and of the multitude of like all of the incoming sensory data that you could possibly attend to, you attend specifically to those incoming signals that confirm that diagnosis you have for yourself, that depression. And I mean, I'm not like a depressive person, but I have been in ruts, I would call it, where, wow, I can't really get myself out of the situation. Like, look at all these bad things happening to me. And it's like, well, you know what? Like, the whole framing I have about my whole life at that point in time is specifically geared to blind me to anything good that could possibly happen. And I think a healthy psychology is one in which you can you have a useful framework and like some useful, I guess, like tools in your mental toolkit to pull yourself out of that situation and to sort of say, hang on a second, like there are good things happening to me. There are, I'm in a social situation like that I've something bad has happened to me before. Therefore, I expect it to bad to happen again. And that's the anxiety loop, right? Where it's like, hang on a second, like this was a positive social situation. Like there are positive aspects of this. Like I'm attending explicitly to all the things that could go wrong. Whereas I could be attending towards the potentially super generative, like positive start points of this situation. And again, I mean, this is like the hardest thing in the world, like because it is literally your, I mean, it's your model of reality, right? Like that is everything that you can possibly conceive, and like to actually alter that, it's brutal. It's like you need like a different framework on life. You need like a different like
You need Christianity, maybe.
well, this is the thing where you and I would kind of differ because I think you're further down that path than I am personally, I
Okay.
would say. Um, and I think it's a solution. I think personally I've found a lot of success with like Buddhist principles in general. And so I think, maybe it's worth touching on where I am. It's like I I just feel like Buddhism is the truest, and I don't think it's like a religion in the same sense Christianity is, but I think in terms of like actually like understanding this model that we're talking about like the psychological layer, this kind of physical layer, Buddhism is it got there like 3,000 years ago, and they just like they got it, and through a bunch of like symbolism and allegory, they've been talking about this and this like this model, this unified model of your perception um, for a long time. But frankly, I don't think that like Buddhism has much in the way of like cultural institutions that can build, I guess, the type of society that I would want to live in, if you know what I mean. And so I guess I'm in this like weird middle point between the two, where I'm like, okay, culturally speaking, I like a lot of the values downstream of Christianity. But in terms of my personal, like, I guess, religious practice, I'm probably much more on the Buddhist kind of angle, in terms of like, I meditate as opposed to, I guess, what you would call praying. Although I think there's a lot of different types of this, and I think in a lot of ways there's a lot of crossover. It's just on different things that you're visualizing, you're meditating, you're like kind of working through. So, but yeah, look, I mean, over to you, man.
Yeah, I mean, I would interestingly, and this we can probably go further on this another time, but I'll just make a quick comment there that I think that the things that you are getting from Buddhism that you'll find that you can also get from Christianity. I think the same way. I think there's a almost like this um is the same way that Tom Holland talks about that we are helplessly Christian and the way that we see the world is basically like what you would also do with Buddhism in a way. Like you're seeing the reason why Buddhism makes sense to you is because you have this implicitly cultural Christian framework within you. And that's that's a very quick like comment, and we can definitely go further into that. What I wanted to talk about is what you were talking about before about being in that depressive mindset, and therefore that just sort of like shadows and clouds everything that you're looking at in the world. And the reason why I think and there's maybe it'd be a good way to like plug this new thing that I'm writing about because actually I touch on this topic and it's about actually seeing the world in a framework and basically seeing the positives in life, and that's where prayer comes in and that's where meditation comes in because what praying and I guess meditating does is it primes you to see the positives in life. So when you wake up in the morning and you say, look, dear God, I want to have a good day today. I want to see the opportunities and I want to take full advantage of them with every sort of like inch of my body. Then when you go about your day to day, because you've been primed, you will begin to see these opportunities. And there's another Matthew verse actually, which is from Matthew 7 which 7 to 8, which says, chapter 7, verse 7 to 8, he says, "Ask and it shall be given to you, seek and ye shall find it, knock and it shall be opened unto you. For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened." And that is essentially saying, look, you've got to ask, you've got to know what you want in your head before you start seeking. Things in life aren't just going to appear to you the way that you want them to. That there's a relationship that you have to have with the world when you're interacting with the world. You have to have, well, what sort of relationship do you want to have? Do you want to have a positive relationship with the world? And if you do, are you primed to have that positive relationship? And I think how I look at that into and how I because I like to think about things again, what I talk about in this is like how do I have these concepts and ideas but apply them to a real world situation, because ultimately that's what I care about is having a better life. And it's like when you, I know we're both in relationships so maybe you'll relate to this, but maybe you've been in a situation where it's like your girlfriend's done something that has kind of like bugged you and it's annoying you, and maybe she's done it just then, and you approach her about it, and it was like, why did you do that thing? And it's already off to a bad start because the you're not primed in the right sense. You're not actually trying to you're trying to I mean, I'm certainly guilty of this, that I'm trying to like almost I don't even know that I'm doing it, but I almost want to have the argument. I'm almost like I'm in a bad mood, and am I actually trying to help here, or am I basically trying to let her know that she's annoyed me? And it's and whenever I have a certain mindset, it always goes bad. It always leads to some sort of like confrontation. And I'd got to remember that, like, what am I actually seeking here in this conversation? And if it's just to inform, then why do it now when you're in that bad mood? Why maybe take 10 minutes until you're in a better mood? I'd be like, oh, by the way, that thing that you did was well, this is my thoughts on it. Um, Interested to hear like your response to my thoughts, and you can approach it in a very different way. And I think that's a way that I'm a practical application of basically and yeah, practical application of how you might approach a situation like that.
This because I read Ben Franklin's autobiography earlier in the year, and the thing I was so enamored by is just like how, and this is like a big thing, the big difference I think between American and British culture is just this like sense of American pragmatism. And I feel like British culture is a lot more kind of like like, even what we're doing now, it's like more philosophical. It's more like, you know, in a sense, like aristocratic, like, in a way elite, where it's like we're just like talking about the situation, like kind of, high-minded, high ideas, and Americans like, well, where does the rubber meet the road? And this is so well captured for me in Ben Franklin's quote, God helps those who help themselves.
Hmm.
And I think that kind of encapsulates that Matthew point you were talking about there in like a really concrete way. I think just like kind of taking a step and putting this out of Christianity, because one of the things you and I talk about a lot is like we as a culture have like ripped ourselves so far away from like like, I both have friends who would come to mind when we talk about this, where like if you were to frame anything like I see that smile, God helps those who help themselves, and like even if you're like an irreligious person, like I think you ought to be able to like understand what is meant by that phrase. But I feel like we're so, in a sense, culturally allergic to anything that smells religious that it's really hard to kind of put these in a mimetically viral enough way that will kind of spread through people's minds and spread and like be effective. I think the way in which this has been secularized and like you've pulled out the value of a lot of the stuff we're talking about now is through mindfulness and a practice of gratitude. And for example, like me and my girlfriend, before we eat every meal, we like take a second to be like, I'm grateful to have food. I'm grateful to have some time with you. I'm grateful for my life, like that, I'm not in like a war-torn hellhole, basically. And it doesn't need to be like, thank God for um the blessings I'm about to receive or whatever we said at school. It's like, um, okay, well, let's strip out what this is trying to do in a sense. Um, I think though, ultimately, like it will never at the start be as deep as something that's like as long and historied and has been through so much like kind of cultural evolution in the same way like genes go through kind of survival of the fittest, like memes go through survival of the fittest. So yeah, man, I think yeah, I guess I'm also rambling a little bit here, but it's like, where does the kind of secular version of that get you versus like the the religious version? I mean, what are the downfalls of that? Like, also, like, how do you even get people to like start re-engaging with a more timeless version? I guess the way I've seen it happen is just like people who are like temperamentally very conservative, like traditional things, and they want to kind of cling to like old-fashioned things. Um, but then how do you speak to those like temperamentally kind of more, I guess, liberal, kind of open-minded people and get them to like loop back into these kind of older ideas? And I think the way it's only really worked is through like at the moment, like mindfulness is completely secularizing all the parts of religion. And the one thing they haven't done yet is the community aspect, clearly, and like getting together and singing together in a big group, specifically, everyone coming together and singing, specifically singing, which I think is like the biggest thing that like secular life has lost. I mean, there's only narrow places you can do it in a secular sense, like a football game, um, sports in general, protest probably. All these things have like massive singing components. Um, but when I used to sing hymns at school, with everyone, and we're all like belting it out, singing together, it's like that loss of the sense of yourself and like kind of the greater whole. And that's when people get the chills down the spine. Music has a very tight coupling with that sense of awe. Um, so yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I think we're trying to strip it out, like all the things that worked. We haven't really done a very good job of it, I guess. Um, yeah, I'm curious, what are your thoughts there?
I think this is the natural next step for Christianity and for the Western culture. And I think that what we're seeing is especially with Trump being re-elected is this desire for people to basically um, see past political correctness, see past like was essentially um like wokeism, I guess. What I think that political correctness and wokeism is like a facade. It's the same thing that the Gospels talk about when what Jesus talks about in the Gospels when he talks about the Pharisees, and what the Pharisees are is a sect of Judaism at the time, and what they were doing was actually corrupting their own religion. They were sort of bastardizing it. They were using the traditional practices of Judaism to display virtue. So they were basically praying in public, and they were uh, saying like, "Look how good a person I am! Like I'm praying. I'm doing all these things that make me a good person. Am I?" And it's essentially like the first time it's really been stated as a vice is this virtue signaling and then displaying good characteristics, and that's not a good thing because it's shallow and it's very superficial. And actually, what we want to be doing is living in a world where we're being truthful. And Donald Trump is someone who I see as, yeah, okay, he says things which is completely bullshit and he exaggerates and he embellishes things, sorry. And he's a silly character, obviously, but there's something very honest in what he's doing, and there's something true in what he's doing. For example, what I mean by that is that he is consistent. So yes, he might be very um absurd in how he comes across, but there's a consistency in what he's doing. So you know what you're getting with Trump, and there's a and there's a an element of truth in his behavior in that regard. And I think that that can't be said for the other side, where you actually don't even know what you're getting with them. And it's all a complete facade and it's all virtue signaling. And I think that that's where the sort of cultural shift is leaning towards, is this element of searching for truth. And obviously a lot of the Christians side with Trump in this sense. I'm not saying that they were doing it for Christian reasons. Maybe a lot of it is populism, but what I think what you'll notice is a lot of like the sort of religious commentators like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro and things like that are all on Trump's side, and I think that that's because they see the consistency in Trump's message. So even though he might be saying things which are uh, factually false and things like that, I think what how we started this conversation, which was differentiating facts and truths. Yeah, okay, Trump might be saying things that are factually wrong, but is what he's saying true? Is it true? So, for example, is it true that illegal immigrants are coming over and eating dogs and eating pets and cats? Well, factually, it might be false, but the essence in what he's saying is true, that they're actually coming over and they're uh, breaking a boundary that they should not be overstepping, and the boundary that they're overstepping is a personal one, and it's something that is going to affect you on a personal level. And what the message that Trump's saying is actually true, but a lot of people take things very literally, and they take things like, and that was, and this goes back to this whole point that you were saying about the material world that we live in, and so there has to be I think there's a theme in what we're saying, which is, look, we need to be focusing what is true and not what is factual. And also, because we're basically differentiating what is true and what is factual, we have to have this re-emphasis on the truth. And how we do that has to be through a certain doctrine, I suppose, that we all subsume in our day-to-day ethics. And that's where I think the sort of Christian Renaissance is has to start basically in the West, and I think that that's how we get to some middle ground of religious secularism, and I think that that's actually the reason why I regard that conversation with Richard Dawkins and Jordan Peterson as a watershed moment, was because that was actually them attempting to do that. Jordan Peterson is an expert at actually secularizing a lot of what Christianity talks about, and I think that the, because he never resorts to the supernatural explanations. He's always and even when he's pressed on it, he does admit, look, I don't know. Like, I don't know if the resurrection happened. I don't know if Jesus was born of a virgin. And and I actually plan on writing something else because I could go a lot deeper onto this, but I think asking the question, was Jesus born of a virgin, is uh is the wrong question to ask. And I actually came up with this analogy yesterday when I was thinking about it, and it was basically things have a teleology, and that's basically like the purpose that something has. Like, what is this purpose of something? And for example, the purpose of a knife, the teleology of the knife is to cut things and it's to slice. But you wouldn't use that knife to scoop up like water or something. You wouldn't use it as a fork. You wouldn't use it as uh, an instrument to like play with your guitar with. Yeah, it's got a certain purpose and it should be only be used for that purpose. Now, the Bible or the Christian framework has a teleology. It has a purpose. It has a meaning. It has something that it's aiming to do. And by asking a question, was Jesus actually resurrected, is actually trying to use the knife as a spoon. Is you're actually getting away from the point or the meaning of the whole text and the scriptures in the first place. And I think that there becomes an element of, and the thing that, and how to know if you should ask these questions is, I think that there's some things in the world that ought to be sacred. And I think that when you're asking certain questions and you're trying to almost trick someone into and by asking them, was Jesus born of a virgin? The What you're doing is you're asking the wrong question with the wrong intentions, and you're almost trying to demystify something, which is I guess analogous to actually touching something that ought not to be touched. And I think that that's where the notion of sacred of what sacred is, and what sacred means to me. That there are some things that you just do not touch and do not go near, because otherwise you you have too much power in a way. You become you seek to know everything, and you become all knowing, and I guess it goes back to this very original story of Adam and Eve, where if you know, then you will die. And we could, I guess, have a full conversation about what does he mean by you will die in that sense when they become aware of what good and evil is. But that's, I guess, I just touched on a few topics there on like that bringing together of that secularism. of Christianity. What's your thoughts on that?
Um, yeah, I think I'm going to leave the politics aside for 1 second because I want to kind of steer it back to the metaphysics. Um, I I think you're right in the sense that it's the way that um the kind of new atheists that you and I both grew up like watching wrecking cardinals on YouTube. One, the argument was because they're the cardinals and whoever like all these people on YouTube having like back and forth debates back in like 2010, 2011. Um, they for the Christians, for example, I think they believed that it had to be physically the case that Jesus was literally resurrected, which is not an argument you can hold up in a kind of materialistic frame of mind. So they were dragging their framing down into the materialist framing and saying, and then they were losing on the grounds that like what they're saying isn't in that kind of physical reality layer. Where you and I agree on religion, it's that it doesn't, you would say, okay, fine, don't, that's sacred, don't touch that. What I would say is it's like it's not important. What does it say like about the physical world? Let's say, what does it buy you psychologically that Jesus was resurrected, that he was born of a virgin? Like, what is like the psychological cachet of like the fact that you would believe that that's the case? And that's where I think the distinction is kind of lost. So I think, for example, like talking about the resurrection, it's like the fact that he was crucified, died for your sins, and came back. Again, I'm not like um coming at this from like myself, like a super Christian angle. I'm much more like psychologically fascinated with this. Is like, the skin in the game of like the literal God to like come down and suffer the worst possible death, and that people would rather have been burnt alive than crucified, and like physically go through that himself, and then take all of like the psychological significance of like him taking all of the badness of the world away, including all future badness, and that's already happened, and he did it for you, and you didn't even have to ask for it, and like it's already there, can take someone who's like destitute, drug addicted, like, create a mental model of yourself, someone like walking around London, homeless, like their families abandoned them, they like be like beneath contempt, like, and saying, well, no, literally like the supreme, like there's some psychological character, like instantiation of like the supreme being above everything, like sees you, cares about you, has like died to like take away all that badness, and that forgiveness is there for you no matter like how much bad stuff you've done. Like we can redeem you as a person. Here's a psychological framework to do that. Here's a set of like axioms that you have to accept that can help you. I mean, firstly, forgive yourself for like all the awful things you've done, like all the kind of awful things you've seen. And so, firstly, the first like kind of forgiving yourself, and then forgiving other people, and then kind of clawing your way back from that abyss. Like, I think it's really like fascinating the fact that like, um, Alcoholics Anonymous is like an explicitly religious program. And I'm just not convinced that you could come up with a purely secular alternative that would be as effective as that, right? Like, the reason that works is because you take people who have like stolen from their families, who have, like spat on the people that love them most, like burned all their bridges, and you're offering them like this, again, psychological framework to pull themselves back from that brink. And so again, like this is where I think, maybe you and I would agree or maybe disagree, but like I'm always interested not in like, it's bring it back to like Richard Dawkins saying, was Jesus literally born of a virgin to Jordan Peterson, a Christian in 2007 would have said yes. And my whole belief in Christianity is predicated on the fact that all these things literally happened. A fundamentalist Muslim might say the same thing, right? Like everything in the Quran is a literal word of God, literally happened. Whereas what I'm saying is, okay, fine. Like I think, you know, does it matter? Like maybe it matters with respect to like how much of a purchase it can have with you psychologically, but like, does it matter explicitly if what we're getting at here is a psychological program that has for thousands of years kind of like built individual units of a society that can kind of in a fractal sense build a greater, bigger, cohesive civilization that works. And yeah, so I think that's where like I guess I'm coming from, and I think you know
Yeah, I agree with you.
I like this analogy as well, just to like kind of tie off the point. Like when I was in like the lab in doing my neuroscience, we did a lot of like stuff in like the wet lab with like bacteria, and you could take like a petri dish full of bacteria, and you could flood it full of like antibacterial like solution, and almost all the bacteria would die, and then like one or two would survive, and then the whole population would like kind of go like this, and then it would spread back out because those are the bacteria that are resistant to that bacterial solution, and they can now like well they have that resistance, they can like kind of build themselves back up. And this is a lot, I think, of what happens with ideas. And I think the phase we've been through now with like the new atheism movement is like, this is the ultimate logical endpoint of the Enlightenment that kind of Nietzsche saw coming. We kind of wiped it all the way back to its bare bones, and like all the kind of super literalist interpretations of Christianity don't work anymore. But the thing is, with this religion in particular, it's incredibly dynamic in a way that I don't think any other religion is. Like in Islam, you kind of only have like two main branches, like Sunni, Shia, and they're kind of as old as the religion itself. In Christianity, you have way more like scope for dynamism, scope for like, Quakers, Catholics, Orthodox, like different aesthetics, different sets of beliefs, different like politics, like coming backwards. And I think what you're going to find is that this psychological Christianity that we're talking about now is that one bacteria that's kind of survived. And I think it's probably already seeing just with the pure like popularity of Peterson, like how that is now like spreading back out, and like this explosion of young people going to churches, and this explosion of like you know Pentecostal Christianity in particular is like the fastest growing religion in the world, and it's because of Africa, and it's just like a branch of Protestantism that is just massively popular with people in Africa, but also people who've emigrated from Africa recently and their children in places like London. So yeah, I mean, look, again, I've done quite a few things there. So um, after
Yeah,
you,
I think I like what you're saying about the bacteria thing. I think one thing that is important to note in that analogy is that if you were to another thing that's analogous to that is basically like becoming immune to a disease, like for example, a vaccine, and the very, very, very coincidentally, maybe it's inbuilt into the whole structure of life itself, but the archetype of basically the hero overcoming the villain is basically what you've just described in science actually on the petri dish, because what does if you were to use what you've just described in a as a and like what happens when a human is vaccinated, that when in order for a human to become immune to a disease, they take a vaccine, and what is in that vaccine is actually part of the thing that they're trying to vaccinate against. So for example, with polio, there's polio in the vaccine because that's you need some of that within you in order to become resistant to it. And that is so analogous to the archetype of the hero actually overcoming and winning the like and winning the battle between his nemesis. So, for example, in Harry Potter, he has a part of Voldemort within him, and that's why he is necessarily the only one who can defeat Voldemort. Because when Voldemort tries to kill, his family in the first film, he succeeds in killing Harry's mum and dad, but then Harry's left with this scar on his forehead, and this is and I remember sending you this GIF of Harry Potter showing the scar because this is the exact same idea that I had when I saw the Richard Dawkins Jordan Peterson thing because he has something now. He's got an element of the thing that he was contending against within him, and by the last film, you find out that in order to defeat Voldemort, you have to destroy all seven Horcruxes, and it was discovered that Harry Potter himself is the last Horcrux. He is the last thing that has a piece of Voldemort within him, and that's why and it's necessary that he is the one that has to defeat Voldemort. It's the exact same thing in Star Wars as well, in Revenge of the Sith, when Luke Skywalker is beating Darth Vader, his dad, with a lightsaber, and he's defeating him, and then he looks down at his hand, and what does he see? He sees Darth Vader's hand as his own hand, that he's almost becoming like his father, that he's got a piece of Vader within him, and an idea that is as old as time that you have to subsume the thing that you're contending against in order to grow and propagate. So I love what you're saying, and that's what was making me think uh, as you were saying it, and I was thinking back to those thoughts that I had after the end, and that's another reason as well why I thought it was such a watershed moment that conversation between Dawkins and Peterson. Another thought I had when you were talking about Christianity and the different sects of Christianity, and another reason why I'm so fascinated with the idea of Christianity is because this is what we're talking about with the different sects. It's almost like Christianity is the body of Christ, and because within each person we all have, like what I was saying earlier, we all have these different fragments of each other. And the whole point of Christianity is to have these different sects and is to allow for different sects because otherwise, if you just say that, okay, this particular sect of Christianity is the above all else, then you're already doing the wrong thing there because the point of it is love yourself like you love your neighbor. You got to love your neighbor. You got to love the person who's also in a different sect of Christianity.
Do you think that's
And
an
this,
incredibly Protestant thing to say?
well,
Like,
it's
don't you think? Like that is, it's kind of taking the idea to the extreme of like this has to make sense to me or else it doesn't make sense, you know? And that's not what I think Catholics would argue or Orthodox Christians would argue.
I think Chris, I think they would argue what I've just said in the sense that you have to love your neighbor because I think that's what Christianity teaches. And so as someone, I think someone who's Catholic could not would have to agree with that because those are literally the teachings of Jesus.
Yeah,
And
but like ultimately the whole I guess what I'm getting at is like the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism is that in Catholicism it's like the church and the dogmas of the Pope and
but that's
that's
okay. But that's okay. But my point is that it's good that they follow that. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't have that perspective because again, like what Nietzsche was saying, that every fraction of an individual, every sort of characteristic strives to be the ultimate characteristic or to have the ultimate viewpoint or and to be the master of all values. And so it would make sense that Christianity, that different sects of Christianity would see themselves as the final or the truest interpretation of Christianity. And it's actually okay that they do that so long as they also believe that you have to love your neighbor, which is actually a common thing amongst all different sects of Christianity, which is interestingly because what that love allows you to do is actually unify all the sects together. Because without that message of love, then you become fragmented and then there's conflict and then you're not able to unify all the sects. But Christianity as a whole has to is the unification of all these different sects.
I think yes and no. I think um, up until the Treaty of Westphalia, this was not the kind of predominant way of thinking. But I think there was just so much like brutal slaughter in the 30 Years' War over like differences in like slight differences in metaphysics that the broader kind of Christian community agreed to disagree, basically. And I think, and I think I have to kind of wrap things up a little bit here, and sort of head towards a conclusion. But I think it's interesting that there's like a fragmentation in like a universalist religion down to like different sects, to different like even now like personal interpretations of that religion. And I think this, it kind of reflects broadly what I think is happening in society, which is like a complete breakdown of like shared consensus in general, like two people looking at the same situation and not passing the Rorschach test, basically, because it's like, every any given event in life is now a Rorschach test where it's like um multiple interpretations, people place different weightings on different aspects of the same situation. And I think this is a trend that's only going to kind of get worse, not better, as news feeds become more kind of like personalized. Your personal diet of like inputs becomes so like kind of fragmented and to like a factorial degree, as opposed to like um before, where it was kind of much more like constrained source of information. And I guess just to tie us back into the point, like I think, yeah, maybe it's the case that we do see even more fragmentation before we see less and kind of more universalism. And maybe that leads to conflict, as it already has like kind of, there's already like extremely violent digitally. Like it's extremely violent, like not like in the physical sense, but like political violence in a sense of like attacks and like media attacks is already like kind of really up there. So I mean, I guess that's kind of my closing remark here. I think you're right in one sense in that the it's supposed to be like a universalist kind of idea, but where I think you're wrong is that it's not always been the case, and I think it's actually a bloody compromise that it is the case. Because I think if we reopen those doors, I mean, I just don't think people are that willing to be that violent over points of metaphysics anymore, which is probably a good thing, you know. Um, but yeah,
Yeah, I agree. I think that one thing to like sort of make clear is that I'm not saying that that's what that viewpoint that I was putting forward was always the viewpoint. And I think one of the things that you actually said yourself about Christianity is that it has that update mechanism inbuilt into itself. And even you were saying that the question that Richard Dawkins would have debated, in 2007, would have had this very literalist viewpoint. And I think you would agree with me that it was actually just the type of Christians that he was debating. It wasn't necessarily the
and
most
by the way,
common
that
nation
update
of
mechanism
Christianity.
is the single most important factor, I think, that separates this out from other religions. I think Judaism also has, to a degree, that update mechanism because they have this concept like the written Torah and the oral Torah. But I don't think there's many religions that have that capacity to kind of
Hmm.
morally update. And I think that in alone is like the single most fascinating thing about Christianity.
And to add on to that, it's even more fascinating that you're actually using the exact same words in the text to do the update mechanism.
Yeah.
Because I've not sort of sought another text to have this new interpretation of basically unifying all these sects of Christianity to get this whole idea of Christ. It's actually that whole idea is in the text, and it's the same things that Jordan Peterson is talking about with this whole new idea of Christianity. I mean, I feel like your objection to like what I was saying is basically the same objection that you would have to John Peterson, and that a lot of people have to John Peterson, which is what you're talking, how you describe God is not how people have described God for the last 2,000 years. So like, how do you know that that's your right interpretation? And I would say correct. Like that isn't the way that people have seen it, but I'm actually using the tools and the conversations, and I'm sort of like standing on the shoulders of giants in a sense of to be able to have that viewpoint, this modern viewpoint of Christianity. And I think that that's where, and these are these sort of like conversations that we're having, where we're able to sort of build these new views of Christianity, are is the foundations for like a new sort of world order where we're able to um all live in a world where we share a common ethic, and I think ultimately that's why we're having these conversations, because we're trying to figure out what that's going to look like.
And I think you're right in that, we've talked about this before, but like we are probably on the cusp of like a massive shift. Um, I feel like the point in history that we rhyme with most has to be the Reformation, but all the characters I find really confusing. Like, I don't know who the Holy Roman Empire is. I don't know who the Catholic Church is. Like, Peterson is both Martin Luther, but the anti-Martin Luther. Like, but the whole like moral um turbulence of this time, if you look at movies from the 50s to the 70s, they're just so different. It's like, family with like a dad sitting in an armchair smoking his pipe giving lessons to the family, to like all the like sexual liberation of like the mid to late 60s. And that's such a short period of time. And think about where everything's moved,
Yeah.
even from the shit that people found barbaric in the 60s to now. Like, um civil rights, like gay
Yeah,
rights, again,
you don't even have to go back that far back. You can just look at a
2012.
film like Tropic Thunder and think, holy shit, like that film could absolutely never be made. No.
And that's like late 2000s. And you're just like, Matt, like we're living in like the most like morally turbulent time for probably like 150 years at least. I mean, maybe not. Like, I guess the whole last century was kind of very, I don't know. I mean, we could probably have another like 3 hours on this, but like, so, I think where do we want to leave this? Like, I think for me, like, there's a lot that's going to happen. I think with respect to how we pull ourselves out of this. I think there's going to be exogenous factors. I mean, just the kind of um, riffing here, but I think they're going to be like exogenous factors that kind of make people look for like a value system to cling to, whether that becomes like, again, like a clash of value systems where you get an exogenous kind of like some other kind of value system putting pressure on you. And so people cling to like an identity to like collectivize and fight back against that. Um, I already see this a lot, like the kind of exhaustion of the current, like, I don't know how you want to call it, but like, you know, European mindset or whatever. Like, it just feels exhausted. And it feels like something is going to like refresh. And that could refresh in a negative way too. I'm completely like open, like open to seeing that happen as well. We're already like on track, I think, for the next 10 years to be an incredibly conservative decade. Not just Trump getting elected, but like across Europe. In the UK, we've elected the most right-wing, left-wing government that um, that I think we've ever seen. Um, in the rest of Europe, they're electing predominantly right-wing leaders. I think there's going to be a massive kind of like backlash, shift back to kind of more old school European values potentially. And again, like that could be a bad thing as well, right? Like I think you could also, what one plausible thing I see happening, which I already see happening, is there being a massive gender divide in the value systems, right? Like you already see one of the biggest predictors of which party you're going to vote for being your gender, which is mind-boggling. It's like if in the US, like it's almost all men Republican, almost all women Democrat, then it's like, well, you solve the birth rate issue. They can't even like find like an equal like framework to view the world in. So yeah, I mean that's kind of where I want to leave it. Like I guess we've had a very moral turbulent 60 years. I think it's going to be another 60 years potentially. Um, and I think it's going to speed up, not slow down. So that could be like great thing or a bad thing. But as Bob Dylan says, strap yourself to a tree with roots, you know?
Mm. I think just to end, I think that let the new conservative sorry, I think what conservatives I can't speak now. The new sort of conservative mindset has been um the actually what's been on the left. I think what the left has done is actually conservatism, and what the right is doing is actually a new liberalism, because what the new right wing has also is kind of making space for is actually creativity, whereas you can't be creative on the left. And traditionally, the conflict between conservative values and liberal values was that you weren't able to be creative as a conservative because that was, you know, you wanted to conserve the tradition, whereas the liberals were always ones that were wanting to reform and to instantiate new ways of thinking. And I think that actually this whole shift to the right that you're talking about is actually going to allow for much more creativity in the world in a positive way, which I think is, and so I think we're
Potentially.
hopefully, I mean, potentially, but certainly I see it happening much more than what it would be if it was dominated by left, by left politics. And I think that
But again,
the
yeah, but I mean, I agree and I disagree. Like, I think um, I guess like the best way to put your argument back to is saying like the pearl clutching sensitive people in the Reagan era were like the old Christian grandmas who were like, you're swearing on TV, oh my God. And that has, in the sense, has flipped, right? Where it's like now the pearl clutching people are people who like really like worried about getting offended. That's not.
But but I don't think that we'll ever go back to that the same way that I don't think that we'll ever go back to a world where everyone believes in the resurrection and just takes that as like a literal fact. Because I think our morality has updated since then, and
Yeah.
the way that we view the world has updated since then. So I actually think that when we talk about going back to conservatism, I don't I think that we're not going back to that sort of like old grandmother like saying no to like you know drugs and like saying no to sex on TV and things like that. I think what we're going back to is actually traditional values, which is what I mean, which is actually we want to value the individual and value truth. And I think the left doesn't value truth, and that's the difference. I mean, is on a more fundamental level, not on how it's manifested.
Where I would disagree with you is I think it's just way more fragmented, and I just don't think there's going to be any broad, like predominant consensus anymore in general. Um, and I think you will have left-wing people who do really care about truth. You'll have left-wing people who are kind of religious. You're gonna have left-wing people, in the same way you're gonna have like right-wing people who my whole point is this is like this complete fragmentation now. And what we're never gonna go back to is a shared sense of making sense of the world. Um,
I I think that we'll I think we can go back to that.
I mean, that's a positive note, I think, on which to end. Maybe that's a topic for our
Yeah,
next discussion because
yeah,
we're running out of
absolutely.
time. But thanks, man. Look, we've I don't even know what to title this because we've talked about like 1,000 things. I guess
Is it possible to put audio through ChatGPT or like through AI? No.
potentially be like, what do you think of this conversation? Like,
Well,
uh,
where mainly I was like, I basically asked AI to come up with the title or to like basically list the words that we said the most or like what
a
topics did
heat
we
map.
talk about the most.
Yeah.
Yeah, and basically look at it that way. But maybe it's too technical. Um, but
Yeah, maybe
yeah,
I'll give it a go.
you can think about it.
Cool, man. This is fun. This has been like a fun first time. Let's do this like regularly, yeah.
Yeah, really surprised as well that like we absolutely could go on forever to talk about, which is made me appreciate podcasts a lot more actually
And also we
because
don't stay on any
go
given
forever.
topic because they just kind
Yeah,
of go on. Anyways, sick man. Have a nice evening.
you too. I enjoyed that.
Bye.
Peace out.